The rain fell with the force of someone who had grown tired of warning. The streetlights flickered as if they might give in at any moment, and the cars sped down the avenue, oblivious to the pain that walked slowly along the drenched sidewalk. She was there, a pregnant woman in a thin coat, her hair plastered to her face, dragging her feet as if carrying far more than her own weight. In her hand, a plastic bag with a few wet clothes. In her eyes, the quiet resignation of someone who no longer expected to be seen. But it was there, at that exact point where concrete meets loneliness, that life decided to make an improbable move. A sleek black luxury car with tinted windows screeched to a halt in front of her. Instinctively, she stepped back, shielding her belly with her arms. The door opened slowly, as if hesitating before what was about to unfold. And then he appeared. The man who stepped out of the car was tall, elegant, with a face etched by stern features and eyes that had cried too much for a heart that pretended to be stone. His name was Arthur Delacroix. At 48, he was known in the business world as the investor who saved failing companies, but no one knew he was a man on the verge of emotional collapse. Barren since his 30s due to medical complications, divorced, he lived in a mansion where the echo of his footsteps was his only constant companion. He was a man who knew everything about risks and profits, and nothing about forgiveness, but something about that woman standing in the storm stirred something within him. A faint scent, a memory, a shiver that came from the soul, not the skin. "Are you okay?" His voice came out low, muffled by the rain and his own disbelief. The woman took a moment to respond. When she lifted her face, her eyes, brown, deep, familiar, cut through time like an invisible blade. Arthur froze. His mouth parted as if to say something, but silence was quicker. She looked away, clutching the plastic bag to her chest. I just need somewhere dry. I'm not asking for anything. Just a bit of shelter." He swallowed hard. Her voice was still the same, soft, yet wounded. Her name finally echoed in Arthur's mind, like a forgotten prayer rediscovered in the pages of a dusty Bible. Helena, the woman he had loved and left years ago. The woman who now carried a child in her womb, with no ring on her finger, no home, no protection. And there, standing before the man who had once promised to care for her, she was alone, soaked, pregnant, invisible to the world, and finally visible to him. Arthur hesitated, but something stronger than fear pushed him to act. He opened the car door. "Get in." Helena stood still for a few seconds, as if she knew accepting that gesture might mean reopening wounds that had taken years to heal. But her belly was heavy. The cold stung, and dignity doesn't warm itself alone. She got in. The car moved silently through the wet streets, reflecting the trembling city lights. Neither of them spoke. Her scent was still the same, subtle lavender and a hint of wet earth, and that hurt more than any memory. When they reached the mansion, Arthur opened the gate with a dashboard remote and parked in front of the stone staircase. Helena looked at the house and then at him, as if asking whether this was truly real. Inside the mansion, the contrast was stark. Polished marble, Italian designer furniture, absolute silence. Arthur handed her a towel and went to fetch a blanket. When he returned, she was sitting on the sofa, eyes downcast, one hand stroking her belly as if apologizing to her unborn child for every misstep. Arthur wanted to ask so many things, but the only sentence that came out was, "Are you hungry?" Helena nodded, almost imperceptibly. As she sipped warm soup in the kitchen, lit by a soft yellow glow, Arthur leaned against the counter and watched her. Everything about her seemed the same, yet different. The way she blew on the spoon before bringing it to her mouth, the distant look in her eyes, as if conversing with ghosts. And then he saw it. Around her neck, hanging from a delicate chain, was the necklace he had given her 8 years ago, on the day he swore he'd return, and never did. A silver crescent moon pendant with a tiny inscription, "For when the longing hurts more than the silence." Arthur felt the air leave him for a moment. "You still wear that?" Helena lifted her eyes, and for the first time they faced each other without shields. "I never took it off," she said. "Not even when you left me." The silence that followed was as thick as the mansion's walls. Arthur stepped closer, hesitant, as if approaching a truth he had spent years running from. "This baby, is it your husband's?" "I don't have a husband," she interrupted firmly. "Not after you." Her response thundered within Arthur. The confession wasn't a plea for pity. It was a verdict, a mirror, a thorn. He wanted to ask if the child was his, but his courage wasn't ready yet. Instead, he just sat down, close enough to hear the sound of the world breaking in silence between them. That night, Helena slept in one of the guest rooms. Arthur stayed in the living room, staring at the necklace left on the coffee table. The pendant swayed gently, as if reminding him that some promises don't die. They just wait for the right time to be reborn. And there, alone, the millionaire who had everything realized what he had truly lost. It wasn't just a woman. It was the future she carried. It was the peace only she brought. It was the forgiveness he had never dared to seek. But sometimes time grants a second chance, and this story was only beginning. The morning sun barely touched the mansion's stained glass windows when Helena descended the stairs slowly, hands on the railing, her eyes scanning the space as if navigating foreign territory. She wore a loose shirt Arthur had left on the bed, her hair still damp from a shower. The furniture remained cold, but the aroma of fresh coffee and warmed bread gave the place an almost living quality. Almost. Arthur was in the kitchen, his back to her, preparing something that aimed to be a gesture of care, but carried the weight of years of silence. "Good morning," she said in a low but firm voice. He turned. He still wore the white shirt from the previous night, now slightly wrinkled. In his eyes the same familiar exhaustion, but something had changed. He seemed less armored, or perhaps just more tired of resisting. "Good morning. I made coffee. I thought you might want something warm again." She nodded. She sat at the table but kept her hand on her belly, as if reminding herself she wasn't alone. "The doctor said the baby is healthy," she said suddenly. "I get checkups at a public clinic when I can." Arthur sat across from her, his fingers interlaced as if facing an invisible tribunal. "Helena, He hesitated. "Why did you disappear like that? You never answered my messages, never called back. I thought you'd moved on, gotten married, forgotten." She laughed, but without joy. "I disappeared?" she repeated. "Arthur, you vanished after your trip. You said you'd be back in 2 months. 2. And you never returned. No calls, no visits, no explanations. I waited. For almost a year. I bought bread as if you might show up any moment. I slept with my phone in my hand, and one day I realized you were never coming back." Arthur lowered his gaze. Guilt burned him like acid. "I got sick, physically. I found out about my infertility during that trip. It was such a brutal shock that I just shut down. I was afraid to tell you, afraid to disappoint you, afraid I wasn't enough for you anymore. So I chose to disappear before you could leave me." Helena looked at him for a long time, her eyes welling up. "You didn't understand anything, Arthur. I never needed perfection. I just wanted you." Those words broke something inside him. A wall, a pride, an illusion. "And this baby?" he finally asked. "Is it mine?" Helena looked at him for what felt like an eternity. Then she took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and said, "No, not biologically. But if you ask me if he's part of our story, then yes. He's everything that remained of the love that made me strong when you left." Arthur felt his eyes burn, but he didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, he stood and walked to a shelf where an old photo frame stood. In it, a picture of them smiling on a beach, barefoot, with the whole world ahead of them. He handed it to Helena. "I never took this photo down." She held the frame as if rediscovering something buried in time. "And I never took off the necklace," she replied softly. That afternoon he took her to a private doctor. For the first time in months, Helena felt the weight of responsibility shared. She felt seen, cared for. The doctor performed an ultrasound. The sound of the heartbeat filled the room like a hymn of redemption. Arthur squeezed her hand as he listened to the sound of new life. He cried silently, and in that sound he heard more than a child's heart. He heard the forgiveness he still didn't dare ask for. In the days that followed, Helena grew more at ease. She wandered the mansion's halls, touched Arthur's books, studied the sculptures he collected, and sometimes stood by the window just to gaze at the sky. The rain had stopped, but inside her, storms still lingered, waiting to be calmed. Arthur, meanwhile, rediscovered the act of presence. He bought maternity clothes. He set up a nursery with pastel-colored furniture. He hired a cook just to prepare Helena's favorite dishes. But what touched her most were his silences, now less oppressive, more human. There was love there, quiet love, but evident. One afternoon as they walked in the garden, Arthur stopped suddenly by a rose bush. He cut a red rose and offered it to her. "Remember the first time I gave you a rose?" Helena smiled with her eyes. "You stole it from your neighbor's garden and got scolded for it. But I kept that rose until it was completely dry." They both laughed. For a moment, they were themselves again, without time, without trauma, without distance. But the night still held surprises. After dinner, as Helena read on the sofa, Arthur went upstairs to his room and returned with a small wooden box. He sat beside her and handed it to her. Helena opened it slowly. Inside was a ring, the same one she had left on his dresser years ago when she realized he wasn't coming back. "You kept this?" "I kept everything that remained of you," he replied. "And now I don't know if I deserve it, but I want to try. I want to be part of your life, part of this baby's life, even if he's not mine." Helena touched the ring with trembling fingers. Tears began to fall, one by one. "Arthur, it's not about deserving. It's about having the courage to start again." He moved closer. He didn't kiss her. He didn't touch her. He just cried. For the first time, he cried out loud. And Helena held him in her arms, as if understanding that some pains don't need to be spoken, only felt. That night, they slept in the same bed, but not as lovers. They slept as two survivors who had found shelter in each other's souls. And something new began to grow. The days that followed were like steps on crystal, beautiful, fragile, dangerous. There was an improvised routine, a quiet care, a tenderness that slipped through the cracks of silence. Helena smiled more often, though her eyes still carried the weight of someone who had known abandonment up close. Arthur became a constant presence by her side, taking her to appointments, making tea before bed, reading to the unborn baby, as if hoping, somehow, his voice would take root in that tiny life. But as much as it felt like a new beginning, one question hung in the air like an invisible sword. What happens after the birth? One night, Helena sat at the piano in the living room. Arthur, entering, recognized the melody instantly. It was the same one she used to play on Sunday afternoons when they lived together years ago. Clair de Lune by Debussy. But now it sounded slower, more mature, as if each note carried the weight of losses and new beginnings. He approached slowly, as if not wanting to startle the moment. "You still play like before," he whispered. Helena didn't respond right away. She let the final note linger in the air before turning to him. "I play like someone who remembers where they started, and where it hurt." Arthur sat beside her. They stayed silent for a while. Then he spoke. "I wish I had been a better man for you. I wish I hadn't run from fear, but I realized too late that the real fear was living without you." She lightly touched her belly, her gaze fixed on the empty keyboard. "I made mistakes too, Arthur. I shut myself off. I hurt myself trying not to feel. But time shows that some stories don't end just because a chapter was hard." That night was different. They slept together again, but something had shifted. A mutual understanding, an unspoken but real forgiveness. And in the early hours when Helena woke from a nightmare, startled, Arthur held her as if the world were collapsing. And perhaps it was within them, so a new one could be born. The next day, Arthur had an idea. He took Helena to the countryside, to an old family house. There, among green hills and ancient trees, stood a small abandoned chapel. He said he used to go there as a young man to think, to escape the noise. Helena walked to the altar and paused before a dusty cross. She touched it with reverence, as if wanting to say something to God. "Do you think he still listens?" she asked without looking back. "I think he never stopped listening. It's us who sometimes scream so loudly in silence that we forget to hear." In that chapel, without priests, without an audience, without liturgy, Arthur knelt before Helena. "I'm not here to ask you to marry me, not yet. I don't want you to accept out of gratitude or fragility. I just want you to know that if you want, I'm here. For the first time, whole. For the first time, ready." Helena knelt in front of him, her eyes glistening. "And I never needed you whole, Arthur. Just true." They embraced there, between wooden pews and cracked stained glass, as if sealing a pact only their hearts could understand. Back at the mansion, the days took on an almost familiar rhythm. Helena organized clothes, planned the baby's layette, and Arthur renovated rooms to make the house feel more alive. But one last loose piece remained. One last ghost lingered. On a cloudy afternoon, Arthur received an unexpected call. It was from a woman named Marisa, a former girlfriend with whom he'd had a brief relationship after their separation. The news hit him like a punch to the stomach. Marisa was gravely ill, and there was a chance Arthur had been the sperm donor used in a fertility treatment she underwent years ago. He hung up the phone in shock. The world seemed to spin. Helena noticed the change immediately. Arthur was restless, trembling, silent. That night, he told her. He braced for an explosive reaction, a shout, a hurt, but she just listened. After a few seconds, she asked, "Are you going to take the test?" Arthur nodded. "Yes, I need to know. But Helena, this doesn't change what I feel, or what I'm building with you." She took a deep breath, touched her belly gently, and replied, "I just ask that you don't run. Whatever the result, stay." 2 weeks passed. The test confirmed that Arthur was, in fact, the biological father of a 5-year-old girl Marisa had raised alone, never telling him. Arthur's world crumbled and rebuilt itself in the same instant. He was now a father, biologically a father. But more than that, he now knew his love for Helena and the baby she carried didn't depend on blood, it depended on choice. He told Helena. He cried. He begged forgiveness for the confusion, for taking so long to grow, for everything. Helena embraced him. Anne said only, "Now you understand that being a father isn't about origin, it's about presence." And in that embrace, they sealed a new beginning. The sky was clear, but Arthur's heart still carried clouds. Now he was, officially, the father of a girl named Clara, and that placed him at a new emotional crossroads. The child was living with an aunt, as Marisa had been hospitalized in critical condition. Helena watched him from a distance, not interfering, but with a look that said more than words. "Don't run again." Arthur knew what he had to do. He scheduled a visit, and he went. Clara was small, with curly hair and brown eyes like Helena's, which unsettled him. She was drawing when he arrived. She didn't recognize him, but she watched him with curiosity. Arthur crouched down slowly, offering a toy he'd bought on the way, a plush giraffe. "Hi, Clara. I'm a friend of your mummy's." She took the giraffe carefully, sniffed it, and then smiled as if that gesture was enough. She didn't talk much. She just sat on the floor and pointed for him to sit beside her. Arthur sat. They stayed there for nearly an hour, drawing together, without needing grand explanations. Sometimes love begins like that, with the silence of two strangers who already belong to each other without knowing it. When he returned home, Helena was waiting on the porch. "Well?" Arthur took a moment to answer. "She's beautiful. Quiet, strong. I think she has something of you, believe it or not." Helena smiled faintly. "Maybe because you only see the world now through the eyes of someone who's lost too much." Arthur stepped closer. "I don't want to make the same mistakes, Helena. Not with her. Not with you. Not with this baby. I thought my story was about losses, but maybe it's about reunions. I just need to know, do you see me in this future?" Helena looked at him for a long time. Then she walked to him and instead of words took his hand and placed it on her belly. The baby moved. "He already knows you, and so do I." It was enough. They didn't need to decide everything in that moment, but something had been sealed. A pact without paper, without ceremony, but with soul. Days later, Arthur brought Clara to spend the weekend at the mansion. Helena prepared the girl's room with new toys and colorful pillows. When Clara arrived, she ran to Helena with the naturalness of children who sense where love resides. In no time she was calling Arthur Uncle and Helena Aunt Lena. That night she fell asleep between them on the sofa, with a serene smile and a blanket pulled up to her chin. Time passed quickly. Helena's belly grew heavier, her steps slower. Arthur, now balancing caring for his partner and getting to know his daughter, seemed more alive than ever. One day, coming home from work, he found Clara painting a hallway wall with finger paint. Beside her, Helena laughed, sitting on the floor. "You're destroying my house," he teased, feigning indignation. "We're decorating it with life," Helena replied. "Learn." And he did. He learned to laugh at stains, at stumbles, at improvisations. He learned to let the mansion shed its coldness to gain soul. But life, with its subtle irony, decided the turning point would come with pain. It was a quiet early morning. Helena woke with a strange, deep pain that wasn't just physical. Arthur rushed her to the hospital, panicked. The doctors hurried. There were complications, high blood pressure, risk to the baby. Arthur waited in the waiting room for hours that felt like centuries, until a doctor approached, his expression grave. "The mother and baby are alive, but it was an emergency delivery. Premature. We'll need intensive care for a few days." Arthur ran to the neonatal ICU window. He saw his son, so small, so fragile, with tubes and sensors, and he cried. He cried like a father who finally understood that love is vigilance, that being present is resisting fear with faith, that caring is staying, even when you have no control. Helena, still groggy from anesthesia, squeezed his hand. "Will he be okay?" "He will, because he's strong, like you, like Clara." She smiled, weak but full. "And you?" Arthur kissed her hand with reverence. "I'm only whole when I'm with you all." In the days that followed, Arthur spent mornings in the ICU, afternoons with Clara, and nights watching over Helena. He learned to pray, to sing softly to his son, to give thanks for minutes, to discover that a miracle isn't what you ask for, it's what you nurture. 2 weeks later, the baby, named Raphael, gained weight and was moved to a regular room. Arthur held him for the first time, his hands trembling. He felt an inexplicable warmth rise from his chest to his eyes. "You don't have my blood," he whispered, "but you have everything I am, because I choose to love you. And that's more than biology. It's a decision." Helena watched the scene silently, tears streaming down her face. And in that moment she knew Arthur had transformed. He was no longer the man who fled from the past. He was the man who chose to stay, even in the face of the unpredictable. The house was no longer the same. The mansion of marble and silence had become a home of nighttime cries, forgotten bottles, toys in the hallway, and unexpected laughter. Clara now called Arthur Daddy without him correcting her. Raphael, though still fragile, slept in his crib beside the bed where Helena and Arthur took turns in nights of affection and exhaustion. There was a family there, not perfect, but real. And time, so used to taking, now seemed to give back. Arthur found himself immersed in scenes he'd never imagined for himself, changing diapers, decorating walls with star stickers, telling made-up bedtime stories. But it was on an ordinary morning that an extraordinary moment happened. Clara, watching Arthur prepare a bottle for Raphael, approached with a sheet of paper colored with crayons. It was a family, a woman, a man, a curly-haired girl, a baby. At the top, in crooked letters, she'd written, "Our home." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He knelt before her and asked, "Do you know what this is?" "It's what we've become," Clara replied, smiling. He hugged her tightly, as if trying to hold time itself in his arms, and in that embrace, a belonging was sealed, without documents, without DNA, but with truth. Helena watched from a distance, moved. In her eyes there was something deeper than joy, the certainty that the love that gives is stronger than the love that demands. Arthur was no longer just a wealthy man. He was a man who had discovered that nothing is worth more than building a shared soul. But life, with its need to test promises, decided to throw a new challenge. One afternoon, Marissa passed away. The funeral was quiet, with few friends. Arthur attended. He brought Clara. He said goodbye with respect. And then, in an act of courage, he formally requested custody of the girl. There were documents, procedures, interviews. But there was also the strength of a man who, before a judge, said with wet eyes, "I'm her father. Not just by biology, but by choice. I know her, I love her, and I'm ready to be everything she needs." The judge looked at him in silence, then finally said, "That's more than enough." Clara was now officially his daughter. Upon receiving the news, Helena hugged him with the strength of someone who understands that miracles take many forms. That night, as they put the children to bed, they sat on the porch. The sky was clear, starry. Helena rested her head on his shoulder and said, "Have you forgiven yourself yet?" Arthur was silent for a moment. Then he replied, "Not completely, but every gesture of yours, every smile from Clara, every breath from Raphael, brings me closer to it." "And do you think God forgives?" He looked at the sky, then at her. "I think God never stopped believing I could still change. And he used you to remind me of that." The next day, Arthur prepared a surprise. He took Helena back to that same countryside chapel, but this time it was restored. There were flowers, candles, new pews. At the altar, a gleaming cross. She entered in silence, touched by the beauty of the gesture. Arthur approached in a light suit with a serene gaze. "I'm not here to ask you to marry me again. I'm here to ask for something bigger, that we consecrate what we already are, that we surrender our story, our pains, our children, and our dreams into his hands, not as a ritual but as a spiritual commitment." Helena cried silently. And there, without witnesses, holding hands before the altar, they prayed. They didn't ask for riches or guarantees. They asked only for courage to love when it hurts, wisdom to guide when they falter, and faith to continue even when everything seems to crumble. In that act, they sealed not just a love, but a mission. From that day on, they decided to turn the house into a temporary shelter for mothers in vulnerable situations. Helena knew the pain of having nowhere to go. Arthur knew what it was to live surrounded by luxury, yet feel poor in affection. Together, they chose to welcome, and the stories began to arrive. Pregnant women rejected, alone. Helena received them with warmth, shared her own journey. Arthur offered safety, food, and a listening ear. Clara helped pick out clothes. Raphael, in his crib, was a living testament that life could be generous. The home became a beacon. One day, while painting a wall in the shelter's reception room, Clara asked, "Daddy, why do we do this?" Arthur answered softly, "Because one day someone reached out to me when I needed it most, and now it's our turn to do the same." She smiled. "Then one day I'll help someone too." And Arthur understood with tears in his eyes that the greatest legacy he would leave wasn't in wills or fortunes, but in hearts taught to love. The seasons began to change, and with them, what once seemed unchangeable transformed too. Arthur's mansion, once a symbol of isolation and rigidity, was now alive, filled with voices, baby cries, the smell of homemade food, and light footsteps in the hallways. It was where tired eyes found rest, and broken hearts discovered they could still beat with hope. For Helena, the days became a mission of love. She welcomed the women as if they were part of her. She taught, listened, cried alongside them. In each new story she felt the echo of her own journey, and in each new life the promise that everything could be reborn. Arthur, in turn, had become unrecognizable, in the best sense of the word. The man who once signed billion-dollar contracts without looking up now teared up watching a child take their first steps or a mother smile after months of silence. He no longer hid behind numbers or formalities. He was a man present, with paint-stained hands, attentive eyes, and a bare heart. And it was in this new man that Helena fell a little more in love each day. But no growth comes without pain. One afternoon, while organizing documents in his office, Arthur found an old letter tucked between books. It was from Helena, written in the year he left her. The envelope was torn, but the contents intact. She had left it at his doorstep before leaving for good. The handwriting trembled in places but was resolute. "Arthur, if you ever come back and still want to know the truth, read this. I waited for you. And it wasn't a little. I waited with all the strength a love can bear. I waited in cold days, empty nights, silences that screamed your name. You told me you loved me, but you vanished, and I had to learn to survive with that absence. I discovered that not loving anymore is a lie. We just love differently, sadder, more mature, more alone. If you find this letter, don't look for me out of guilt. Only look for me if you still have the courage to love. With all that's left of me, Helena." Arthur held the letter like a relic. He read and reread it. Then he went down to the garden where Helena was talking to a young mother who had just arrived. When she saw him with the letter in hand, she froze. "Where did you find that?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Hidden among the books, like time was waiting for the right moment to deliver it." She looked away, but Arthur approached, gently touched her face and said, "I didn't look for you out of guilt. I looked for you because, even without knowing it, I always loved you the only way I knew how. Now I love you the way you deserve." Helena embraced him. There, before silent witnesses, they sealed once more a bond that time couldn't erase. The following month, Arthur decided to do something symbolic. He organized a small ceremony in the mansion's garden. Not a wedding, but a public commitment. They invited all the women who had passed through the house, friends, neighbors, even former employees. Clara was the master of ceremonies, wearing a yellow dress with a flower in her hair. Raphael slept in Helena's arms, peaceful. Before everyone, Arthur took the microphone and said, "I spent half my life trying to prove to the world I was strong, and the other half trying to hide that I was fragile. But it was when I embraced my fragility that I discovered what truly matters. Helena taught me to be human. Clara taught me what belonging means. Raphael taught me that not everything that's ours comes from blood. And every woman who passed through this house taught me that love has no logic, only courage. So today I don't promise perfection. I promise presence. I don't promise answers. I promise listening. I don't promise an eternal house. I promise a home, as long as God allows. And that's what we are now, a miracle made of encounters. Applause filled the garden. Helena, moved, took the microphone and replied, "Years ago, I walked in the rain with a wet bag and a womb full of uncertainties. Today I walk beside the man who gave me back my ground, not because he's perfect, but because he came back, because he stayed, and because he chose to love, even without guarantees. If that's not faith, I don't know what is." The ceremony ended with Clara handing out small stones with handwritten words: faith, forgiveness, second chance, shelter. Each guest took one as a symbol that in that house words carried weight and healing. Days later, at the end of a quiet afternoon, Clara climbed onto Arthur's lap and asked, "Daddy, why did you cry when Raphael was born?" Arthur smiled, hugged her tightly and replied, "Because in that moment, I understood that the love we choose is the strongest of all, and that God gave me so much more than I asked for." Clara thought for a second. "Then I'm going to love a lot when I grow up, to heal everything." Arthur closed his eyes, moved. "And you will, my daughter. You'll heal the world with your love." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Autumn arrived slowly, painting the trees in shades of gold and rust. The leaves fell silently in the garden of the house that now held more than people. It held promises, healed secrets, and futures shaped with tenderness. Arthur, who once measured value only in stock markets, now gauged his success by the number of dinners shared at the table, stories told by candlelight, and drawings taped to the fridge door. One morning, while Raphael slept in his crib and Clara painted on the living room rug, Arthur called Helena to the office. He had reorganized the space, now adorned with family photos, toys on the shelves, and an armchair that seemed to embrace whoever sat in it. On the desk was an envelope. "What's this?" she asked, wary. Arthur smiled warmly. "A gift or maybe an invitation." She opened the envelope and found documents. Arthur had transferred half the ownership of the house and the shelter to her name. Helena covered her mouth with her hands, overwhelmed. You're giving me half the house?" "I'm giving you half of what's now ours," he replied, "because without you, this would all just be an empty castle. You brought soul to this place. You brought home." She cried, not because she needed it, but because she finally felt that belonging isn't demanded. It's offered. Later that night they sat in the garden to talk, as they always did after putting the children to bed. Helena, barefoot on the cool grass, asked, "Have you ever imagined what your life would be like if you hadn't stopped that car on that rainy night?" Arthur looked at the sky for a moment, as if returning to the exact moment of the miracle. "I don't like to imagine, because it hurts, because I would have lost everything that truly matters. Life gave me a chance, and for the first time I had the courage to stop, to look, to listen, and to love," she added. He nodded with a brief smile. "To love with truth, without running, without needing to be invincible." Silence, and then something unexpected. Helena looked at him intently. "I want to marry you, Arthur." He turned, surprised. "But I thought you wanted to wait, that our commitment was enough." "I waited for you long enough. I waited in the rain. I waited in empty rooms. I waited in nights when only God heard me. And now I want to stop waiting. I want to affirm, to seal, not for formality, but because this love has already crossed death, abandonment, silence. I want to tell the world, this is the man who stayed." Arthur held her face with both hands, his eyes glistening. "Then let's get married. Simple, true, ours." And so they decided the wedding would be in the garden, with autumn leaves falling like silent blessings. The women from the shelter helped set everything up. Clara was the flower girl, with a crown of natural flowers. Raphael, carried by one of the mothers, held a cushion with 2 rings tied with a satin ribbon. There was no priest, no judge, but there was faith. Before everyone, Arthur spoke. "I got lost, out of fear. And out of fear I distanced myself from the only thing that always saved me, love. Today I return, whole, and I promise not to run anymore, not when it hurts, not when life presses. I choose you, every morning, every failure, every fall. I choose you not because you complete me, but because together we learn to be whole." Helena replied, "You don't owe me perfection, just presence. and that you gave me, even without promising. I love you not because you came back, but because you had the courage to stay, to be a father even when you weren't, to be a home even without knowing how. I love you because you rebuilt yourself before my eyes and rebuilt me along with you." The ceremony ended with a collective embrace. The women from the shelter, the children, the friends, all gathered around the couple. It was more than a wedding. It was a testimony that some pains heal with time and others only with love. That night, sitting on the living room floor, Clara asked, "Now, are we a real family?" Helena pulled her onto her lap and replied, "We've been a family since the first yes we said with our eyes." Arthur added, "And we'll keep saying yes to each other, every day." Clara smiled, looked at the ceiling and said, "Then I'm going to write that on the wall tomorrow." They laughed, and they let her, because in that house the words painted by children were worth more than expensive paintings. Time passed, but the gestures remained, and the love endured. Spring arrived like a confirmation of what had been blooming for a long time within that house. The days were longer, the laughter louder, and the scent of flowers planted by Clara filled the hallways with an aroma that evoked childhood and redemption. Helena cared for the shelter as if it were an extension of her soul. Arthur managed the resources, the renovations, and above all the small gestures. He remembered the name of every woman welcomed, their stories, their fears, and their victories, woven together like threads by invisible hands. Clara grew with a spark in her eyes and a precocious wisdom. One day, she found a baby bird fallen from its nest. She brought it inside, wrapped in a scarf, and placed it on a cushion. "He's scared, Mommy," she said, "but we'll take care of him until he learns to fly again." Arthur overheard and knelt beside his daughter. "That's what you all did for me," he confessed. "You found me when I was scared of everything, and you stayed until I learned to fly again." Helena just smiled, because true love doesn't demand gratitude, it simply is. On Raphael's second birthday, they organized a simple party in the garden. Balloons, a chocolate cake made by one of the shelter's mothers, and soft music in the background. But the most memorable moment came when Clara climbed onto a chair, clapped her hands for attention, and said with all the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted to say, "I want to thank Daddy and Mommy, because they made my heart a big place. Now it can hold more people, and if anyone is still sad, they can come live in my heart too." The crowd was moved. Helena cried. Arthur cried. And even one of the newly arrived women, who hadn't smiled in weeks, let out a shy laugh. That was it. That house was no longer just a home. It was a heart beating collectively. But life, ever diligent in its lessons, decided to send a new test. An accidental fire, caused by a short circuit, destroyed part of the shelter's wing. No one was hurt, but the damage was significant. Helena watched years of work turn to ash in minutes. Arthur ran, organized help, got people out of the building, saved documents and important photos. But when it was over, he saw Helena kneeling in the garden among ashes and tears. He approached slowly, knelt beside her, and said, "Hey, we'll rebuild. Together. Like always." She didn't answer. She cried in silence. Then Arthur wrapped his arms around her and murmured, "When I found you that rainy night, you were nothing but resilience. But today you're a root. Nothing will uproot you. Not even this." The following week, instead of sinking into sadness, the couple decided to turn the tragedy into a new beginning. They launched a public campaign. They shared the story of the house, the women, the restarts. A moving video recorded by one of the mothers went viral on social media. Within 48 hours, hundreds of donations began to arrive. Materials, food, money, volunteers. People from all corners wanted to help. But among all the messages, one stood out with special force. It was a handwritten letter from a young woman named Bianca, who had lived in the shelter 2 years earlier and was now a trained nurse. "Uncle Arthur and Aunt Helena, I never said this when I lived there, but you saved my life. Back then, I wanted to give up on everything, but seeing how you loved us even without obligation healed me. Today, I'm a nurse. I care for people the way you cared for me. If you'll have me back, I want to help rebuild the place that rebuilt me." Helena held the letter like it was a miracle. "She came back, Arthur. She came back out of love. And so they rebuilt everything, brick by brick. But now, with the help of those who had once been welcomed, Women who arrived broken and returned whole to offer what they had received, care. The new shelter wing was named Clara Luz, a tribute to the girl who, without knowing, taught that love multiplies when shared. And one peaceful night, Arthur sat on the edge of the bed holding Raphael and said, "I used to think love was conquest, but now I know love is permanence. It's staying, even when it would be easier to leave. It's relearning every day, and that's why, even with flaws, with scares, with losses, I'm here." Helena approached and hugged him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "And I'll be here, until God calls us, because where there's a wounded soul, this house will be solace, and where there's a hunger for affection, this family will be bread." Arthur closed his eyes and whispered, "Then so be it, for all those still to come, for all those who need to believe that love exists." It was late afternoon when Arthur, now with slightly graying hair and the eyes of someone who had crossed deserts, walked along the porch, watching the sunset reflect in the shelter's newly restored windows. Beside him, Clara balanced a glass of juice, excitedly telling him about a new friend who had arrived, a 6-year-old girl named Luna, who didn't speak much but drew as if she had the entire sky in her eyes. "She drew you, Daddy?" Clara said with pride. "With a superhero cape." Arthur smiled and ruffled her hair. "Then I'll have to earn that cape, won't I?" "You already do," she replied simply. "You save people's days just by being near." Those words echoed in Arthur like a seal. A reminder that, though he hadn't won every battle in the outside world, he had conquered the most sacred territory, the hearts of those who truly knew him. The man who once feared leaving no legacy now saw his values perpetuated in the eyes of a child who chose to call him father. That night, after putting Clara to bed, Arthur went down to the quiet living room. He found Helena there, sitting on the sofa, staring at the unlit fireplace. She held an open notebook filled with entries, thoughts, and stories from the women who had passed through. It was a kind of collective diary of the shelter. "They left words of gratitude before they went," Helena said, showing him the pages. "But what moves me most is that every one of them wrote the same phrase at some point. I was seen." Arthur sat beside her and ran his fingers over one of the phrases written in blue ink. I was seen. So simple, so profound. How many times had he himself felt unseen, despite the money, the influence, the public image, and how many lives were lost to the margins, invisible? "You saw them, Helena, and that's why they bloomed." "No, Arthur, we saw them, and that changes everything." In the days that followed, Arthur made a decision. He would write a book, not about finance or business, but about love, redemption, and the power of stopping to see the other. He began drafting his memories, the rainy night, the reunion with Helena, the first time he heard Raphael's heartbeat, Bianca's letter, Luna's silent eyes. The title was simple, The House That Stayed. And in the preface he wrote, "This is not a book about me. It's about every person who left thinking they weren't enough and returned to find that love was still standing. It's about every tear that watered a new chance. It's about the house that didn't fall, even when everything around it seemed to crumble, because it was built on forgiveness." The book became a symbol, not a commercial bestseller, but a work passed from hand to hand, from shelter to shelter, from heart to heart. It was read in discussion circles, churches, prisons, and wherever someone read its words, a truth was planted. It's always time to return. It's always possible to begin again. On Raphael's 5th birthday, they decided to hold a special celebration, a collective picnic in the open field behind the shelter with tents, homemade food, and performances by the women themselves. Helena organized everything with her usual grace, and Arthur prepared a small tribute for the occasion. At the end of the afternoon, he took the microphone, holding Raphael in his arms, and said, "5 years ago, I held this boy for the first time. I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't know if I deserved to be here, but he taught me that loving is a daily act of courage. And all of you, you taught me that true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we offer when no one forces us to give. Today, this house isn't just ours. It's for everyone who believes love can restart even in ruins." The applause came with tears and embraces. At the end of the night, Helena, holding Arthur's hand, gazed at the starry sky. "I thought our story would end that night you left me," she confessed. "But now I understand that was just the beginning, and this is just another chapter," he replied. "The best is yet to come." And then, in silence, they kissed. with the kiss of those who survived, rebuilt, and now chose every day to stay. Time, with its quiet elegance, moved forward like a gentle but firm current. Arthur's hair was whiter, his eyes softer. Clara, now 12, helped the shelter's mothers organize rooms, drew with the younger children and read stories to the newcomers. Raphael, at 5, was curious, full of questions and laughter. There was a legacy in their gestures, not of blood, but of soul. And it was in this kind of eternity that Arthur now believed. One morning, while watering the garden flowers, Arthur heard Helena call from the top of the stairs, her voice calm yet tinged with love and surprise. "Love, there's a letter for you from the publisher." He climbed slowly, drying his hands on a cloth. He took the envelope, opened it carefully, and read. It was confirmation. His book, The House That Stayed, would be officially adopted as reading material in social projects and emotional rehabilitation programs across the country. The publisher said the book had transformed more lives than they could have imagined. People reconciling with parents, children returning home, couples asking for forgiveness. Arthur read in silence, swallowing his emotion. When he finished, he handed the letter to Helena. The seed sprouted, he said, gently touching her belly, which now once again carried new life. Yes, Helena was pregnant again, a serene, unexpected pregnancy that arrived like a miracle. The doctor had said years ago that the chances were nearly non-existent after Raphael's birth. But God, sometimes, likes to defy statistics. And now, new life was growing there. A new chapter, unhurried, without demands, just grace. That night, they sat on the same sofa where it all began, where she had played the piano for the first time in years, where they had slept side by side, even without knowing if rebuilding what was lost was possible. Raphael slept in his room, Clara wrote in her colorful diary, and the house remained full of voices, scents, memories, and hope. "Are you afraid we'll lose this someday?" Helena asked, resting her head on his shoulder. Arthur was silent for a few seconds. Then he replied, "I would be if I still believed love needed guarantees, but today I only believe in what remains, even when everything changes. And what we have here, it's a root, Helena. It can't be uprooted by winds." She smiled and closed her eyes, as if resting within. The following Sunday, they decided to go to the village church where they had married, that same restored chapel. There was no mass that day, just open doors, empty pews, and a gentle breeze coming through the side windows. Helena walked to the altar, looked at the cross and knelt. Arthur did the same. Then Clara and Raphael joined them, kneeling beside their parents. There, in silence, the family prayed. They didn't ask for anything. They only gave thanks. "Thank you, Lord," Arthur murmured, "for finding me that night when I no longer knew who I was. Thank you for her, for the children, for the pain that taught me, for the forgiveness that healed me, for the chance to start again even when I thought it was too late." And Helena added, "Thank you for not giving up on me when I wanted to give up on everything. Thank you for placing a love that chooses to stay in the path of my loneliness. Thank you for making this house a place where heaven touches earth." They stayed there, kneeling for several minutes. No more words were spoken, only the sound of the wind and the sound of their hearts. It was as if God was saying, "I was here all along." On the way home, Clara made a request. "Daddy, can I write a book too?" "Of course. What will you tell?" "I want to tell how a girl without a father met a real hero, and how he saved not just her, but all the houses that were empty inside." Arthur held back tears and replied, "When you write it, I want to be there, to hear every word." She smiled. "You already are, in every one." When they arrived home, they found a letter left at the door. It was from Luna, the quiet girl who had been adopted by a new family. In the letter, she had drawn a house with huge windows and trees around it. Inside were 4 people, a man with open arms, a woman with flowers in her hands, a girl in a purple dress, and a boy holding a heart. And a phrase written in crooked letters, "Thank you for letting me live in your hearts." Arthur, Helena, Clara, and Raphael embraced. And then, without needing to say more, they all knew. The true miracle wasn't the turnaround, nor the happy ending. It was the simple fact that between the rain and the darkness, 2 people chose to stop, look, and love. The rest was grace.